pleasure for us. And as I told you before, the idea is that you can talk for about 20 minutes, 30 minutes or more if you want, and then we're going to have a quick Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to share screen, and I want to thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure. Oddly enough, that we're doing it by Zoom. I haven't timed the presentation because I didn't know the time, so I will try to briefly go through it to have some time for a conversation. I'm going to be presenting the politics of institutional weakness in Latin America, which is co-author work with Dan Brinks and Steven Levitsky. Wait, it's not coming down. Okay, so that's something. And this is the book, this is part, the theory comes of an edited volume where we have chapters from fantastic people that we benefited from in thinking about these issues, and I highly recommended the book. I love the cover also. And for some reason, my Zoom is not, my PowerPoint is not working right. So I'm gonna go, since this is an audience of Latin Americanists, I mean, I was just trying to put it into context. I don't think that's really necessary. You all guys know, you know, the way in which Latin America came to independence, the peculiarities of the conquest, and the fact that Latin America, along with the US, was a region of early decolonization, and a region that has really followed the US and Western European in terms of importing institutions, a region where state capacity has historically been low, and where elites have traditionally used laws seeking to promote the change of society or build political coalitions, but those laws were not always enforced, or when enforced, oftentimes were changed because people didn't like them. And of course, we had this long tradition already coming from the colonial time of obedezco pero no cumplo, right? So the law enforcement or law compliance with the law has a historic tradition. I just pointed here to two examples: the Mexican 1917 Constitution that established a bunch of social rights that were unique and super advanced for its time, but were not really enforced for a long time. They were given to mobilize peasants or to pay for the mobilization of peasants and labor support, but it's not until that support needs to be mobilized again that these rights are enforced. So again, the variation in enforcement is something that, you know, with my work, we was already with Steve, we have been noticed. And the other example that we normally use that is very clear is that of during the post-war era in Argentina, the Peronists used to win every election until '83. And so the solution to their victories was a coup and a change in the electoral system. But of course, no matter how much you change the electoral system, the result kept being the same. So one of the things that we discuss in that pattern is this idea of trying new institutions, what we call serial replacement, to try to make like a general argument of a more general argument with this. We team up with Dan Brinks and make a theory where we argue that institutional strength is really the result of a political struggle between those who prefer the particular institution that you're talking about, rather than what would be the status quo without that institution. So what's important is here, as opposed to most of the institutionalist literature, we're not really thinking of weak institutions as a mistake of design, as a technical issue, but much more as a political outcome and a political strategy, which actors use to try to achieve some power balance. In doing it, we really look at formal rules and not at norms. Not that norms do not have an effect. In fact, they do have a pretty strong effect, and what that sometimes reinforce and sometimes contradict formal rules. But this is, and I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A, but the measure that we have is about parchment rules, and it's a behavioral measure. So the idea of strong institutions has 3 dimensions, and I think this graph, it's good to see those dimensions. So PO is the prior, so the status quo without the institution, whatever is this institution. And you can think of IO as the institution, the new status quo, and it would make actors change their behavior from what they were originally to the new point. Now, it could be that the new institution, in fact, is what it's called here IO prime, but what really the behavior of people doesn't change to the extent that IO prime prescribed, but only to the extent that the IO prescribed. So in this case, there is a lack of compliance, if you want, and the institution is weaker than it would be if it were IO prime. But it's also important to think that IO prime was more ambitious than IO, right? In terms it asked for like a stronger change in behavior. So if you compare these two institutions, IO and IO prime, with the behavior defined in S, the change in behavior is very similar. So for us, it's important to think both of what the institutions demand of actors, how much those actors comply, and thirdly, how stable is this institution? That means that when people don't like it, can they just change it for another one that modifies behavior or not? And the other thing that's important in thinking about this idea of institutional strength is that we're not trying to be normative, we're trying to be descriptive. It might be that some institutions you want to be strong and some institutions you want to be weak. We can discuss that. I know that's pretty contentious in the Q&A afterwards. So this is not working. So why is this not working? So, okay, in thinking about institutional weakness, we can think that, as I said, this is a fight over rules. Even when rules are not enforced, they still have a certain power. There's still an outcome because they can be enforced. And so there is usually a political struggle defining rules. And you can think, here I provide a few examples from presidential re-election, which is a very contentious issue in Latin America and one that's very easy to monitor. So that's why the examples I think are useful. The one example is Uribe when he wants to go into his third term, which was not allowed legally by the Constitution. The court, the Constitutional Court prevent him from doing, although he was extremely popular at the time. So that is a case in which the rule proved to be strong, not only against the president, but also against public opinion. In contrast, when Evo Morales wanted to run for his for re-election, he not only was not in compliance with the Constitution, but also was not in compliance with a plebiscite that he called to change the rule that he didn't like and where people had not agreed with the change. So he kind of had a court that interpreted in a very strange way that it was his human right, but it was certainly a case of non-compliance with the rule of non-re-election, and one that had a high cost, as we know now. A different case is the case of Correa or the case of Ecuador, in which the rule has been changed every time that they need to change it, in the sense that under Correa, there was a constitutional reform in 2008 that allowed for re-election one term. Then in 2015, he called for a referendum that allowed for unlimited re-election, started in the following term. And then his successor called for yet another referendum that came back to non-re-election at all. So what you can see is every time there is a change of preferences, it's followed by a change of rule. That's what we would call a case of weakness by instability. And I think it's interesting that in some cases, the norm is pretty strong. The US provides a case where the norm sustained until FDR the idea of only one re-election, but of course norms are not compulsory and FDR broke the norm. So that's why rules still matter. And finally, we have, as I mentioned before, ambition is an important dimension that we add in this iteration of our work. And ambition means to what extent does the rule make you change your behavior, or you do what you would have done without the rule. And the case that we have is the case of Peru, in which people hate politicians, And so there is a rule for non-legislative re-election or local government re-election. These are very popular, but even before the rule, because people hated politicians, that's why it's so nice to pass those rules, nobody was. Very few people were being re-elected. So there's not much change, behavioral change, before or after the rule. So just, if I can get this. So these are the three dimensions that we have in our work. The idea of ambition, how much change in behavior is required, and we call an institution weak when it has no ambition, is insignificant. We think the non-re-election rule in the case of Peru is an insignificant rule because it does not change behavior. The second dimension is the dimension of compliance, to what extent the actors behave as the rule tells them they have to behave. And as I showed before, the example of Morales running in 2019, despite the rule that forbid him for doing it, it's a case of non-compliance. And finally, stability. And instability is when every time the actors do not like the rule, they change it to adapt to their preferences so that they can keep doing the behavior they wanted to do because now it's mandated by the rule. And as I show you, Ecuador rules on presidential re-election have that that characteristic. I mean, it's also the case in the Dominican Republic. So let me go a little bit over these three dimensions so we can then discuss them. And in particular, I think their applicability to cases that you might be working on. An institution, when it has zero ambition, is an insignificant institution, is pretty much a symbolic institution. So the design does not predict a meaningful change in actors, even when fully enforced. And we have examples here, and it's interesting that over time, without changing the rules, the institution might produce changes. So Fujimori's constitutional court had 7 judges, only 3 were appointed by the court, by the executive, which, you know, seems that the executive was allowing to be checked, but you needed 5 votes to provide a veto, with which 2 of the 3 executive appointed judges could control the court, and Fujimori had really no constitutional control on himself. I mean, we know that over time there's changes in Peru that change the balance of forces, but originally it was done to have like no effect. I mean, there are other discussions of other laws without implementation rules. And one now that Malu is here that I think it's clear, I hear talk about the ILO and prior consultation and we can discuss, but some of the gender quota laws are almost insignificant because they have not implementation rules, so you can just, you know, some of them have no implementation rules and some of them have very small fines. But prior consultation, for instance, the ILO 169 cannot be used to stop extraction, can only because the demand is for consultation. So some people argue that it has been an insignificant institution. Oops, sorry, I don't know why is this not working. Non-compliance. Okay, so non-compliance, we have 3 types of non-compliance. One, institutions prescribe significant behavioral change, but the state officials choose not to enforce. So that's the clearest case in Latin America. Oftentimes, the president decides not to enforce the law. The case of Bolsonaro with environmental laws, it's a clear case now. The second could be a non-punitive enforcement when you do have a sanction that's basically like paying a fine or paying a toll. And here the gender quotas, we put here Honduras versus Argentina in one case, or even France. Really, in France, you could just pay the fine. In Argentina, if you don't fulfill the quota, you cannot run your list. So that's a much more punitive enforcement. And finally, the idea of weak state capacity relative to societal resistance, to what extent, even if there is political will, there's not capacity, there's not sufficient inspectors or personnel or budget to achieve enforcement of the law. Okay, so type 1, non-enforcement. And here we have 3 examples of non-enforcement, which we also call deactivation. And the beauty of this is that you can always activate. You know, when it is an issue of non-enforcement from above, you can also have a different situation that changes the enforcement. So the first kind of type of non-enforcement we have is what we call window dressing institutions. And in fact, the prior consultation laws in Bolivia, we have a chapter by Tulia Faletic, which makes the case under Egoni, where really window dressing, they look good to be shown internationally, but it's not until Evo Morales wins the election and starts implementing them in the hydrocarbon law in 2005 that they will become enforced. So originally these were institutions that were what I think the Brazilians call para inglés ver, right? So that they show they seem to be doing something, but there's no intention of enforcement. The second type of non-enforcement that we have also in a chapter of the book by Alicia Holland is forbearance. And here is you have different actors in charge of enforcement. Sometimes the actors in charge of writing the laws are not the same actors in charge oftentimes of enforcing the laws. So you have laws that are defined at the national level, for instance, but should be enforced at the local level. And for electoral reasons, it's not good for the local mayor to really enforce these laws, or there is a there is a cost of enforcing the laws given the political coalition of the mayor. In the case of Alicia, she argues that laws against squatting and street vending in Latin America are used as a kind of informal social policy that's free, that you allow people to get a job on the streets or to live for free. And so mayors of the left don't like to enforce them, and mayors of the right or have middle-class constituencies prefer to enforce them. And there's also the issue that there might be the perception of enforcing them has a political cost. Like if you squat people, and it's sometimes perceived as very brutal. And finally, the third type of non-enforcement, I think it's one that has been discussed in the literature also before, the idea of selective enforcement. We have a chapter in the book by Maria Paula Safon about this, and it's how the rule is applied to certain groups and not to others. And she discusses individual property rights and the ley lerdo in the case of Mexico, and how it's originally applied to the church. The objective was to get the lands of the church, but it's not applied to the indigenous pueblos in the 19th century because these are perceived as kind of allies of the liberal government. And it's not until the commodity boom forced, incentivized the Porfiriato to activate this law against the indigenous pueblos to get that land as well, that there is a change. But originally the perception was it was applied to one group of actors, but not to others. And there's plenty of examples of selective enforcement, I think, not just in Latin America. The type 2 is, as I said before, non-punitive enforcement. And these are cases in which the sanctions are so low that they do not modify the behavior. We have a case, a chapter by Garay and Fernandez Nimanda looking at forest protection laws in Argentina, and in particular in the case of Salta, the fines for deforestation are so low that they really do not prevent the behavior of deforestation. And as I said before, legislative quotas in many countries are easily be ignored by paying a fine. If anybody has a question, you would tell me, right, Nestor? Because I'm going fast to have time for the discussion.
Yes, don't worry. I mean, we usually wait until the end, so go ahead.
Okay. So type 3 cases of weak state capacity relative to societal resistance. Here, in thinking about this typology of weak institutions, we think of a state capacity as being relational. It really, you always need a state capacity. You cannot enforce any law if the society, and you always need societal co-production. If nobody reports that it has been robbed, you cannot enforce the law, right? But there's different degrees. Sometimes the society cooperates and sometimes the society resists. And so the power of the state is always relative to what the society is doing. And we have in our typology, two different ways of thinking about the incentives of the state. One is what in the chapter by Amengual and Darjen, they call standoffish states. And this is very common in Latin America, and I have to say a lot of the development world. Their states have limited resources, are not very rich, and so they enforce where it's easier. They prefer this intermittent enforcement because they need to decide how to allocate their scarce resources. So they they enforce in their examples environmental or labor regulations, depending on whether they face societal resistance. So in the case of Bolivian environmental rules in mining, the artisanal miners do not allow the rules to be enforced. So they basically enforce to multinational corporations that do not resist the enforcement. Or in the case of labor regulations, they look at two different sectors associated to construction. In Argentina, the brick makers and the construction workers, and the construction workers have a union, and so when you need an inspection, they provide the cars, they go with the inspectors, it's much easier to enforce, whereas in the case of the brick workers, they don't have a union, they're not organized, and so the inspectors tend to go much more to the construction sites than to the brick making sites, although it's much more dangerous and there's many more risks in brick making than in construction. And second, the other type of law that we have seen used over and over in terms of weak state capacity is what we call, and actually Malachtun and Francesca Jensenius call in their chapter, aspirational laws. And what they argue is that these laws seek to change social norms to generate societal co-production. They look at laws against gender violence. They think it's you know, when you pass the law, the people writing the law do not have the expectation that that's going to stop gender violence, but the expectation is that it's going to change societal norms, and that, you know, in turn would produce the reduction in gender violence. We have examples of laws that have certainly worked. Aspirational laws, anti-dueling laws in the United States were not very effective at the beginning when societal norms make people to duel, but they're very successful. People are not dueling more. But others have failed, even in cases like the US that has a pretty strong state. So the prohibition was certainly an aspirational law that didn't work, right? It didn't change the behavior of society. What's interesting about these aspirational laws is that historically they have been very common in Latin America. The Latin American elites, in their trying to catch up with Europe and the United States, have very often looked at the use of rules with the expectation of changing society. And more modernly, we can think of the constitutionals, the new social constitutions of the late 20th century that have also, like, for instance, in the Brazilian 1998 constitution, it's not that they expected that immediately all these rights would be enforced, but having the rights written would allow the mobilization of society for the enforcement of those rights in the future. Okay, so this is not moving right here. Instability. So finally, the third dimension is the dimension of instability, where rules are changed at a very high rate and in contradictory directions. And I think these two things are important in the sense that rules should change. We always expect the adaptation of rules and in fact, the increasing the ambition of rules over time. But if you keep changing them very often, and in particular in contradictory directions, they prevent the expectations. Actors do not know what other actors are going to do, and whether they would change the rule instead to try to adapt their behavior to the rule. And it would make very unlikely that people would try to adapt their behavior to the rule, to make what's called like institution-specific investments, because their expectation is that the rules are going to be changed. And a statistical analysis shows that electoral reforms in Latin America are much more frequent than in the rest of the world. As I said, changes to term limits in Ecuador and the Dominican Republic happened like less than every 10 years in recent times. Constitutional reforms since independence have happened in Bolivia and Ecuador every decade on average. So again, these are relatively high levels of change that make actors think, oh, the institutions are not going to take hold. It's going to be hard to defend them, and it's probably easier to try to change them. Just very briefly, let me go of why these rules are changed. I mean, these strategies of institutional weakening are used, and we discuss first something that's the audience value. So oftentimes these formal rules are adopted because there is an international or a domestic audience that prefers the rule but cannot monitor its compliance or sustain it over time. So, for instance, I studied the 1990s, a lot of the reforms, the privatization and regulatory reforms, oftentimes because Latin America was desperate for financial, for capital and foreign direct investment, it adopted regulations that look good and promoted foreign direct investment, but there was not a lot of intention to enforce these regulations, but really to make the place more attractive. But even domestically, and if we go to gender, to Malu's topic, oftentimes divorce laws were kept on the books, but with ways for people to really, like in Chile, like you change your address and you still could divorce, but you wanted to please the Catholic Church, so the rule wasn't changed. So that makes the rule weaker, but you still wanted to have it on the books. There's also cases of disjuncture between rule writers and power holders. This could be either because of the difference between the national level and subnational level with different constituencies, we have different preferences and electoral incentives, or there could be cases in which those who have the power to write the rules, especially in constitutional reform cases, do not have de facto power to enforce the rule because economic elites have a lot of power or the military have a lot of power, and politicians have the power to write these aspirational rules in the expectation that there will be a change in the balance of power in the future, and then they will be really enforced. There's also issues of path dependence, and here the idea is in particular for instability, the reinforcing effect of expectations. If you think that they change the electoral rules every election, you, instead of trying to adapt your electoral behavior to the existing rules, think that it's maybe easier to change the rules, and because the rules are so short-living, nobody makes the effort to keeping the rules in time, and it's a kind of self-reinforcing behavior of, instead of adapting in investing in adapting to the rule, you invest in changing the rules. There's also the fact that inequality and volatility, which are high in the region, changes the balance of powers and produce rapid realignments. And those realignments might give more power to those who didn't have power before, and they want to deactivate a rule that existed before, and they prefer it not to have the same strength. Or they can, if they get to power and they activate the rule and they start to make it more effective, they generate a higher cost of strength for powerful actors, and that increases the incentives for replacement. Let me, oops, what is happening? And so yeah, and so why are these behaviors so persistent in Latin America? And we point to three features from the region. I think this is more hypothetical than anything else. And one is, of course, the high level of socioeconomic inequality that generates ambitious institutions to change with aspirational rules. And in a sense, you know, we have majority rule, we have a lot of rights. Latin America really expands rights, but oftentimes these rights are very hard to enforce. Democratization since the 1980s has, I believe, produced an increase in this ambition compliance gap, which we don't see as bad. We think like, you know, the rules are asking for more and more and more, but it's also harder and harder to get compliance there. So, but we are moving behavior, but not as much as the law says, and that generates some issues of legitimacy with the laws. The other trend that is very common in the region, and in particular in the areas dependent of natural resources, is the issue of economic volatility, which is very high and tends to generate electoral instability, in the past political instability, and that makes coalitions very unstable and gives opportunity to change the rules and doesn't give enough time to institutions to be taken for granted. And finally, the historical issue of weak state capacity for its income level, and the fact that the states are relatively weak in the region, and societal resistance and societal organization is relatively strong to states, and that gives opportunity to have the behaviors of standoffish states or forbearance or variation depending on societal co-production. So I spoke for 35 minutes, and I think I want time for conversation. So the other slides, which were on future, where this project is going in the future, I think we can stop here. So I can get the time.
Thank you very much. So I'm gonna open the floor for questions or comments. I don't know who wants to start. I have my own question, but okay, Manu, go ahead.
All right. Thank you. This was so interesting, and I absolutely have to get the book and read it. And it's, I also appreciated, you know, all of the examples from that are associated with gender, of course. And in fact, my own research, PhD thesis, which I've been trying to transform it into a book, speaks quite, you know, very directly to the types of things that you were talking about in terms of, you know, the behavior of individuals to designing, you know, weak gender quotas. And so it was really useful not only to see that in your theoretical framework, but also how, you know, that applies to other types of institutions in Latin America, and explains institutional weakness more broadly. One of the, you know, issues that I faced in my own work, and that I think to a certain extent also applies here, and I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on this, is that these processes, of course, are observed at the level of the legislature, right? But the theory is based on micro-level mechanisms of the interests of political actors, be them legislators or other types of office holders. And so I'm just wondering, empirically, what are the challenges that you and the other authors in the book have encountered in connecting these two levels? And what is it that you have to say about, you know, best practices and essentially testing the theory? Because one of the, you know, just one of the elements that comes to mind is, of course, how to distinguish, for example, between incentives that are, you know, about career seeking or maintenance of the status quo versus ideological incentives, but also things such as, you know, how individual level interests may not necessarily aggregate, right, collectively. So yeah, I know, very broad question, but just.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I think, so certainly we do look for the micro level incentives. And there's not, we had a theory section that we ended up liquidating because there's not a single theory so that applies. What you need to think is what would be the contrafactual, and that would depend on different institutions. It's not that there is a rule for all institutions, and that's why the chapters look at very different institutions. So for instance, on the issue of the national versus the local, the work of Alicia Holland looks at, okay, this law is defined private property at the national level, but you need to implement at the local level. And how do we know that it's a political incentive rather than ideology? So she looks at the same major, the same individual, for instance, that is major of two different, Santiago de Chile is decentralized. So this person was major of La Florida first and was major, which is a kind of a low middle class neighborhood. And then he was major of Las Condes, which is a kind of rich neighborhood. It's one of the three that voted against the constitutional reform. So that gives you a sense. And so the same guy, when he was in La Florida, he was voted by a coalition that was less rich. He did not enforce the regulations against street vending. When he's voting in Las Condes, where nobody wants a street vending, he immediately sends the police to take out the street vendors. So this is the guys from the UDI, it's the same political party, it's the same individual, but his incentive structure changes depending on who are the voters. Or she would look at the city of Bogota and look at how changes from kind of more center-left to more center-right majors shift dramatically the patterns of the enforcement of street vending. So that would be a way in which, specifically you would try to identify the set of the incentive structure, but there's not rule. You would need to think of what would be the contrafactual and how can I measure what would be if the incentives were different. And I think for all of the chapters, that's the exercise and the kind of comparing across cases, within cases, to try to understand what the contrafactual would be.
John?
Thanks very much. Thanks for your presentation, Vicky. I was very interested in this book when it came out. I was particularly attracted by the kind of algebra that you started to use, particularly to apply it to such a kind of multi-dimensional field as institutional weakness. And I'd be very interested if you'd explored using it further. But my question is not so much that, but in the table that you present, you've got a typology of institutional weaknesses, or indeed a typology of strategies that people use to ensure institutional weakness so that their interests are protected against what are the presented interests of whatever change may be brought about. And I wonder whether you have any thoughts about developing that into a policy strategy typology, i.e. that if you're in a context where you start to see one of these strategies emerging, what are the counter moves that you can make to resist the perpetuation of the path dependency or the elite interests at stake or whatever?
Yeah, that's so there's two things to your question. One is you're asking me for a normative implication, which the book doesn't do. Our work is moving more to what are the strategies of weakening that people have, in particular when institutions are relatively strong, rather than preventing institutional weakening. I have to say, for once, there has been relatively strong institutions that were not so desirable, and the example that comes to mind, and in the Spanish edition we open with it, is the Chilean 1980 constitution, right? That it survived longer than people would have expected and prevented some policy adaptations for its strength, and that, many people said had brought Chile to the kind of political insatisfaction and protest that it lived. So I'm not sure we always want political strength. Sometimes you might prefer political weakness. So that's one point. The implications of the argument that we have, so in where are we going in weakening, for instance, one of the things that favors weakening is polarization, right? Because every time you change, the incentives to modify grow. So mechanisms that reduce polarization or that bring people on both sides together to sustain an institution, to agree on an institution, should make the institution stronger by reducing the incentives to, say, deactivate or modify in the future. That's a clear argument. But oftentimes, I mean, it's not so easy to prevent, in the sense that, yes, you know, that's the way, but it's not that you can modify societal processes that go beyond what policymakers can do.
Harry, please.
Thank you, Vicky, very much for your presentation. It's a very interesting typology, and I think my question really follows from your discussion with John. I mean, my understanding is that you are essentially taking institutions as a given and looking at what happens post-institutional existence, right? And I would come back to your example of presidential non-reelection. I don't really know the history of this rule and norm in Latin America, but in many countries it's been around for a very long time. In Mexico, it goes back to the late late 19th century, and it is very much based upon us. It is a valued institution in many countries. The respect for non-reelection varies hugely across the region, and so, how can you explain attacks on or limits to an institution without addressing underlying social norms stemming from the origins of an institution, as it were? In Mexico, even though López Obrador might love to have used his supermajority when he came to office and to amend the rule, it never really got very far, because it really is the third rail of Mexican politics, no? And in other countries, the rule was, non-reelection was adapted when there was greater confidence in democratization. Brazil, for example, in the mid-1990s. But in other countries, it is still absolutely not possible to change.
Yes, that's a great question, Kevin. We investigate the origin of institutions. So certainly, and the changes in norms in society. So one of the examples we have is, and I'll get back to Mexico, which I think is an important case. Argentina had a rule until 1994 that the president had to be Catholic. Nobody cared about that. I mean, Argentina normally changes rules, but that's a rule that nobody cared to change, because the norm is that everybody was Catholic and the president was always Catholic. So why would we change something that it's not? It's basically an insignificant rule. It's not modifying behavior. Until 1989, we get a president that had converted from Islam to Catholicism to become president. So he was more aware that you could be non-Catholic. And of course, the 1994 reforms end the condition that you had to be Catholic. And it was not insignificant anymore, because now you could actually have presidential candidates that were not Catholic. So yes, societal changes generate changes in society. I think that's an adaptation. I don't see as an case of institutional weakness. In some cases, you know, if you don't change, the institution becomes weaker. So the US has these rules on minimum wage that are not updated by inflation. And sometimes the real minimum wage, it's higher than the legal minimum wage. So that is a very weak institution. It doesn't mandate any change in behavior. What's interesting in the case of Mexico is that you bring that institutional strength is associated to the longevity of institutions. So there's a lot of things in your comment on Mexico. It's much harder to change a rule that is taken for granted. But it wasn't always taken for granted. In fact, as you very well known, a lot of people try to tinker with it, not by changing the non-reelection rule, but during the Maximato, by non-enforcing the non-reelection rule. And it required violence, the death of Obregón, it required the exile of Caches. So, I mean, until these norms were created, they were not there, although the rule preceded the norms. So what's interesting in the case of Mexico is the rule was there, originally was not really enforced. There was an effort of not compliance. And then the cost of non-compliance became too high, and now that's a rule that is not just durable, but also enforceable in a country that's not very well characterized by enforcing rules. So that's a very nice case that, yes, we're not saying all institutions are weak. Some institutions in the same country might be weaker and some others might be stronger because there is a history and a set of incentives behind them. The non-reelection rule allowed the survival of the PRI for so long because, you know, it reduced the tensions within the league. But there are other rules. So, for instance, the Ley Federal del Trabajo that under Salinas was not changed because the law was very old from the 1930s. We don't want to change it, but we want to reduce the compliance, right? So the Juntas de Conciliación y Arbitraje were not paying much attention to the law. So again, there are different mechanisms. And it's interesting when the law is very old, as you're right, changing it has a higher cost to its legitimacy. So it might be that in those cases, the best strategy is to deactivate, to ignore its enforcement. And what we say is really, it's not a single political strategy for every institution. It would really depend on the context and the historical circumstances of its creation and how society changed over time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, or can I go with mine? I mean, I have to be honest, I have a couple of questions. But to be honest, I want I wonder if you can clarify a couple of things. I'm really interested in the compliance argument, because at the end of the day, the compliance argument, I mean, if we think about the state capacity as a factor explaining institutional weakness, the compliance factor is probably the most important one, right? Or the most directly related to state capacity. So and when you explain in the book this idea of compliance, I have the impression that at the end of the day, it depends a lot on the relationship between a state and citizens, or if you want to call it the social contract, and the nature of the social contract. Because in fact, I really like how you define that as a social resistance or lack of societal co-production. So, but at the end of the day, it's about the nature of the social contract. So it seems that the state capacity is in some way a function of the nature of that contract. Is that the idea behind this argument on compliance?
So yes, but remember, it's relative. So there might be states that are very strong. I think of the US federal state as being stronger than many Latin American states, but the prohibition was they were never able to enforce it to the point that they need to change the rule, right? So it's always depends, that's what we say, it's relatively to societal resistance. So for instance, Peru is probably one of the weakest states in Latin America. They cannot enforce many things. And yet, for reasons beyond my understanding, I'm waiting to read the dissertation. They're very good at enforcing electoral laws. So the vote is compulsory in many countries, but like you really don't get any fine if you don't vote in Argentina. It doesn't have any effect, but people think, oh, it's compulsory, we all go vote. In Peru, you do get a substantial fine, especially if you're not rich. And how is that the Peruvian state pays attention to enforcing that, but not to enforcing environmental regulations, labor regulations, fiscal regulations? So again, it's just a question of state capacity, state will. It might be that, you know, not only societal actors, but also different elite incentives are at play.
That would be the same case for, I don't know, I was thinking about fiscal policy and tax policy in particular. And because, I mean, when we think about the issue of tax morale, I mean, most of the explanations are mostly focused on this relationship between this social contract between the government and the state. So in some way, one could think about tax policy as a weak institution in Latin America, because not only because of an enforcement problem, because the enforcement mechanisms are weak, but also because there is a lot of resistance from the citizens to contribute to a system that probably don't provide them with with high quality public goods or something like that?
Yeah, I think there is variation on taxation. I mean, certainly the size of the informal sector varies per country. So the capacity of taxing is weaker in Bolivia and in Peru than it is in Chile or Costa Rica. Brazil and Argentina are pretty heavy tax, you know, in terms of tax as a proportion of GDP. And so people in the formal sector pay a relatively high tax compared to other countries, and they do pay it in that. So there is some capacity. I wouldn't make like a generalized argument. I think the idea would be to understand why, so in Colombia and in Chile, the rich never pay because the rules are done in a way in which they can skip compliance. In other countries, you know, the poor don't pay because the rules, the state has not capacity to actually define any compliance there. And in some cases, the rules might change a lot. So it's very common for people at the top of the distribution that every Argentine government that comes does an amnesty to try to get them to pay. So you know there's going to be an amnesty, so you might wait for the next amnesty. You start being strategic about that because you know there is a rule change coming. And so you internalize the rule change. So we all know, for instance, that we all don't know, but we think the next election, the right will win in Argentina, given how things are. So all of these financial regulations affecting taxation might change. So actors, instead of, you know, acting, they start, you know, selling to the future. They start adapting their behavior to this, preemptively to this idea of institutional weakness.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone has any other questions. We have a couple of minutes or comments. Otherwise, I can ask Vicky to comment on just a little thing. I found really interesting the argument about inequality because it's a endogenous argument, right? Because inequality makes institutions weak. And weak institutions make inequality even worse. So I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit more in terms of what is the role of inequality in the whole theoretical argument.
Yeah, I mean, inequality, as you said, has certain endogeneity in the argument because it affects economic outcomes. But inequality in Latin America, we really assume it comes from the process of the conquest, right? The reason we are not like, we don't discuss the Engelman and Sokolov or any of these arguments, but it's true that the elites that are in Latin America are white and the majority of the population is non-white, and that it's really a legacy of the conquest, right? And so, and there are a lot of arguments like John Cosworth and others that the institutional weakness comes from this original inequality. But the problem that we see with inequality is that along with volatility and many of the other things that the region has, it really generates an incentive for anyone, either because they're poor and they want to change when they finally win elections, they want to change the things to, you know, to produce redistribution, and that makes the rich organize and try to change the rules, or because they're rich and they try to prevent change using institutions. But what's interesting for us is the extent to which everybody, and this is probably a cultural effect that we associate with the process of the conquest and decolonization or the independence, there is a kind of positivist, not positivist in the scientific way, but in the legal positivism way, the idea that the rules will produce the change. Instead of having the, you know, in the US or in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, you have the societal change and the rules came. I think in Latin America, the continental tradition of trying to achieve change through rules, it's much stronger. And that's also part of the kind of prevalence that everybody who has been studying rules in Latin America has noticed of this idea of institutional weakness. You're muted, Nestor.
Sorry. Thank you very much. And thank you for accepting our invitation. It was a real pleasure to have you here.